You're listening to stories written and read by Philip Ballerscheff. If you'd like to read along as I read this story, you can find a link in the description of this video to my blog. As always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. This is A Different Picture. The sky, when he could see it, was pearly gray and cloudy. The day had difficulty breaking through, succeeding in that later than it should have done without the clouds being there. He first saw the sun come through clearly around noon, when it was strongest and had reached its peak. A little before that, he had seen it dimly behind the clouds, and he could tell where it was, and roughly, by its arc, where it would be when the clouds parted and the sun forced its way through. Whether it had come on time or later, as it had, it wouldn't have caught him in bed. To be in bed while the sun was out was to be caught off his guard. Sitting at his desk, he was in a position just as vulnerable as in bed, since he tended to bear down on whatever he was doing, and tended to bear down on the day itself. He felt he had to show something for how he spent his time. He called this being on his guard. He was never one of those, not even as a child, who have to be coaxed out of bed and then dragged to their feet if that didn't suffice. He woke early, on most days in a cheerful mood, and out of a sense of habit and of a duty to himself on the days that were the exception to this. Standing over his desk, readying himself before he would head out to work, he was struck by the fact that he had let the magazines and newspapers he had ordered pile up unread. He had reduced what he ordered to one weekly paper. The books his friends had bought him stood in his bookcase, also unread, though with no thin film of dust anywhere to show for it. Looking at them all, the papers, the magazines, and the books, it seemed to him something that he held in reserve, as for a rainy day, or a day when some boredom would overcome him that only they could cure. His idea of a rainy day was as figurative as his idea of being on guard. The day, rainy or not, would come when he would find the time for what he had put aside. He made a plan to read them, one by one, starting with those on the left, by the reading chair, and working his way to the right. Then he would continue with the books behind that first row, and then with those on the shelf above them. Looking at their varying sizes, he estimated how long it would take him to read them. At his office, in front of his desk, was a large horizontal window the size of a painting. The view changed slowly throughout the day, according to the light, so that he could grow accustomed to each stage of its development. This was how he had positioned his desk at home, too, in front of a window with this effect in mind. While arranging his desk this way at work, a colleague had looked at him as if to ask if he needed to do that, if he couldn't find another way. He was large, and gripping the desk by the narrow end, he could carry it without asking someone for help. He made very little noise as he carried the desk, but he apologized anyway and said it wouldn't be long. There was nobody to give him such looks at home, and anyone who saw the way he had arranged it there didn't see, as his colleagues had, the exactness that had gone into it. There was a practical side to it that even they didn't know. It was bad for your eyes to focus on something for too long. When he felt his eyes grow strained, and he looked out into the distance to give them a rest. He had done that one night, working late. The autumn darkness was thick. There seemed little in the distance to look out towards. In the daytime, he might look at the clouds, or at any of the smaller things that were closer to the earth and to himself, and which he yet had to squint at. Through the window of the antique shop on the other side of the street, he could see a light flickering. The light filled one section of the shop and left the rest dark. He wondered how that could be, whether there was a wall between the sections or something else to stop the light from getting through. His thinking slowed the pace of his work to a crawl. Whether he worked now or not, there would be about the same amount to be done tomorrow, and he figured there was nothing that couldn't be left until then. He would confirm this the next day, and only then would that thought occur to him. For now he abandoned his work without these considerations, though he stayed seated to keep up appearances. He had a talent for waiting, especially when he had some way to occupy himself, his thoughts most likely, which he could carry with him wherever he went, or the view if there was one. Before such thoughts about the antique shop had come to mind, what he did was to wait in a daze, slipping into a state of insensibility because there was nothing for him to take an interest in. Standing up without anyone's noticing, he went to the window and looked into the shop. He couldn't see any better than before, not even when he focused on where he knew the light would be and readied himself for when it came on. He stood at the window a while longer. Still, nobody paid any attention to him. Everyone but him was absorbed in their work. The solution presented itself to him as a sign of another store, a jewelry store, came on. It seemed to pop into existence from nothing. Though the darkness wasn't total and the shops not completely hidden, the light that this added gave this sign the effect of emerging from under a cover. Other signs soon followed, and in the space of some 2 minutes, the view had changed utterly. The light of the signs pushed the darkness back only a little out of the space they took up, but it was the best and brightest place to look at. Once he was home and looking at his bookshelf, he continued with the thought he had had to break off that morning. He imagined telling his friends he had finally gotten around to it. Examining the books, tilting his head to better read their spines, he found that their gifts were stabs in the dark, authors they liked and felt he would too, or ought to. Working out the motives they had no doubt concealed, he gave the matter more thought than they probably had. He took the book that was nearest to him and sat down on the chair beside the shelf, not even glancing at the cover, but turning to the first page after those that had been left blank, so eager was he to start. It was a week until he had gotten through one of the books, and another month until he had gotten through the next two. He took his time, so he would have something to say once he began to talk about them. There were some that were historical, and not all about this country, some that were fiction, bestsellers and prize winners, or loosely scientific or philosophical. Whatever their subject, he asked himself what each book had to do with the person who had given it to him. None of them were really polemic about their subjects, though they sometimes seemed about to head in that direction. With this in mind, he reconsidered their intentions. He mentioned his reading to his friends one day, and they were glad to hear of it. More than that was hard to tell. Unlike what he had imagined, some didn't remember that they had given him anything. Others knew that, but not what it was exactly. He told them the title and briefly what it was about. Even those who knew both of these things, behind whose gifts he had most expected there to be some ulterior motive, he saw nothing of the sort. They asked him what he thought of it, and at most, if they kept talking, they revealed their interest in the subject. He had to try, at first, to remember what he was reading. Then he took an interest in it, and it became easier. He might say he had a bad memory, but he could count on himself to know what was important, things that remained useful in daily life, and which, for that reason, it was easy to remember. He remembered the rest, such as where his desk had been before he moved it, only vaguely, and what of this rest he could recall clearly, like that episode with the antique shop he remembered unwillingly to no purpose he could understand. It wasn't often that he tried to fix something permanently in his mind, either because it wasn't worth it or because it required no effort. When he found something he read agreeable or intriguing, he paused for a moment, then continued. When he found something disagreeable, he would start arguing aloud, as if the author were there to hear him. Later, having put the book down, he might think back to it. Reenacting old arguments, he made new retorts, and refined the arguments he had already made, coming to know every scene by heart. He spoke quietly to the voice in his head. At most he broke out into a shouted whisper when the argument reached its climax. He had to speak for both of them to keep the game up, and though he had argued with himself before, This was different. With his conscience or his fear, he could keep a more measured tone, holding himself at a distance from it. With an opponent like this, he had to divide himself between the two sides, and so he grew angry with the other's stubbornness, beginning, in the end, to hammer away at them with what he said, and leaving aside any attempt to convince. He could really work himself up when he got into these moods, and when it was over, he would remember faintly all the other times he had gotten himself worked up. Nevertheless, he was not reflective, though he did dwell on the past. He was made to do it as if by an outside force, going through the same pattern of thoughts and emotions as he had the time before while considering the same subject. The opponents he imagined were stubborn, and if he managed to convince them, it still came about too easily for him to take much satisfaction from it. However well he argued, his opponent's stunned silence was only temporary. They disappeared when he could find no more for them to say, and returned when he was in a mood to argue. That's what it came to be about, regardless of how it began. However often a thought might return, there would come a day when he had argued it out for the last time. One thought went and let go of him, and another soon came to take its place. To him there was no contradiction between his readiness to face the day and his daydreaming. It seemed enough for him to rise early and get to work, and though he might pause to daydream, the fact that he was at work meant that he could gloss over much of what followed. He always got enough done to satisfy himself and his colleagues and superiors. He saw himself at too close a distance to see himself like others did. They and not he could draw these conclusions. His colleagues came to forgive him these lapses. He forgave them theirs by not noticing them in the first place, just as he never noticed his own by not considering them lapses. Having spoken about his reading, he felt relieved of his promise, and it became something he did for himself, looking forward to it at the end of the day, and not minding so much if he was tired and read slowly. It was less often that he flew into a rage, and when he did, it passed more quickly. It tended not to touch him as personally as before. What he dwelt on now was often remote from his own life, what he had read or imagined, and there was less of a reason, if there had ever been one, to revive some argument he could only half remember. It was a change too deep for him to notice it himself, and though a certain hardness had gone out of his face, those who saw it welcomed the change without guessing what lay behind it. At home one evening, sitting in the chair beside his bookshelf, he saw that it was growing darker and turned on the light. In the remaining daylight, it was hard to see what came from the lamp. He kept reading, and soon the light from the window weakened, giving the lamp a greater effect. For a while there was a balance between them as each lighted their own part of the room. Then the light from the window weakened again, and he moved closer to the lamp. To read this way strained his eyes. He read more slowly until at last he rested the book on his knee, thought about getting up to turn on another light, and didn't. He glanced at the reflection the lamp made in the window. Looking in from the window, he imagined, you could see the shape the light cut in the dark. That was A Different Picture, written and read by Philip Ballerscheff. If you'd like to read along as I read these stories, you can find a link in the description of this video to my blog. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you, and until next time.